Welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday Ivan Hour. And we have a speaker who I don't think any of you know. Our speaker is Toby Zens, who has a long history with NMR. And he will talk about the Magnificent Seven of Varian.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, so for those who don't know me, I started building NMR probes in roughly 1976. And my PhD advisor, who I don't know, recommended to the manager of the group, David Grant, that I stop trying to build probes and do some chemistry. And Dave said, Paul, he likes it. And I do like it. So my history, just so I want to make sure everybody understands in all the different places I've been. I left Dave Grant's group and I went to Tulane University to be a professor, and that didn't work out very well. I didn't like them and they didn't like me, which is very typical for me, by the way. So somehow in all of this, as I started out, I managed to get a PhD in chemistry, and I'm also a Varian Fellow, and I'm proud of that. The guys at Varian always seemed to me to be really fantastic. And I was a undergraduate at Cal State LA. I used to see the ads they had. We only hired the best, and had all these wonderful scientific instruments they made. And I thought I would never, ever be able to be there. But somehow I managed to be a Varian Fellow. So with that being said, I want to sort of set the stage here, a few things here. Okay, so Agilent bought Varian NMR in 2010, and I moved my lab from Walnut Creek to Santa Clara. At that time, they had just purchased Nalorac a few years ago, and I had worked for Nalorac from 1989 to 2002 after my first stint at Varian. And I was one of the very first people to move there. And one day as I got into the lab, I was setting my lab up, I found a cart full of books and magazines. And it was the kind of cart that you find in a library where the librarians placed books to be reshelved. And I had no idea where this came from, but I was curious to see what was in it. And so I started opening the magazines, in which I found out were internal Varian publication. On the front page of one of them, I see a bunch of people with shovels breaking ground for the first building to be built in Stanford Business Park. What I found out later was that Varian had shipped these articles to Agilent because they had a library where these intended to house these for historical records. What has happened to these after Agilent jettisoned NMR is not clear, but at least I hope some of the historical point of view of these records still exist. With Agilent exiting NMR and the time that has intervened, Silicon Valley is basically not the same. So one of the things I wanted to go over in this talk was the themes of this talk. And one of them, very important to me, is why did Varian go out of business? Another one is why do some companies thrive for many years while others only last a decade or so? And what kind of leadership is needed to make a company continue for many decades? Now, it turns out in my family, my grandfather was the vice president and treasurer of the largest manufacturing company in Philadelphia for many, many years. The company was founded in 1914, and it lasted till 2018. But it was a very slow decline from 1970 on. The guy who built the company was Mr. Budd. He pioneered in metal fabrications, particularly stainless steel. They made stainless steel railroad cars. They were the first to make all steel automobiles. They did make the first disc brakes, etc. And yet it failed. But that was over a century. It lasted over a century. And so when you ask yourself, well, how long did Varian last? Well, basically from about 1940, when Varian Associates was first founded in San Carlos, to about 2002, excuse me. So a good 50 plus years, not too bad, but still very disappointing. And all you have to do is ask yourself, you look at people who work in steel mills in Pennsylvania, et cetera, and they said when they go, the whole community is wiped out. And for many of us, like for us who were working at Varian, it was a total, so what the heck do you do now? Okay, so that's something you have to think about. Okay, wrong direction, I think. Oops. Okay, so we have Russell Varian, who I think was an entrepreneur, and he was the driver of Varian in those days. He clearly was the driving force behind it. He patented the nuclear induction as a means for chemical analysis. He also had a patent for invention of FT-NMR early on, and he did that as well. So he was way ahead of his time in thinking about things to do at Varian. And one of the things that's incredibly interesting to me is this guy was a very dyslexic person. He was not allowed to attend the physics department at Stanford, but he did take lessons in engineering from Thurman, excuse me. So that was a very important thing for him to do. There's a picture of him with his brother, Sigrud, with the klystron that they developed, which actually saved the War of the Atlantic. And it was a very important piece of hardware. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me is that if you go to Varian today and go down the roads and look at what's there, I went there maybe 5 years ago, and my wife had a hip replacement, and she had it done at Palo Alto Medical Center. And we went by there on the way back down to our house in Monterey, and you looked at the buildings and you couldn't tell who owned them. There was no real signs there. You go down Hanson Way, and you would see few buildings that had small signs that said it was owned by Siemens, but it said Varian Medical on the buildings. Nowadays, when you go by, there are Varian signs all over the place, huge Varian signs, underneath them small signs, Siemens. Very interesting. So anyhow, that's what's happened, but at least the Varian name is still there. Now I have some, on the next slide, you see some pictures. I was telling Dave a few minutes ago, I said, how many times have you gone through that door, Dave? That was the back entrance to the Varian. I don't know how many times. Dave would say the same thing. One of the more interesting things to me is they redid the cafeteria. They tore it down into this beautiful new cafeteria. I have no idea why they tore it down. The number of meals that I had there with various people at Varian is just amazing. So that's another interesting thing. So one of the things that I ask is, why did Agilent dump NMR? So one of the things, and Dave may remember this, and maybe Ron was there when this happened, but they called in everybody from the R&D department, and they had all the groups there, the groups of various instruments that Agilent made, and there were like 5 or 6 of these things. And the guy who was the CEO's last name is Sullivan, and he literally said to all of them, which one of you wants to take NMR on? And the answer was 0. Very, very encouraging. So finally he browbeat one of them and he said, you're going to take it. That was very, very encouraging to us, I have to say. And the point is that they really wanted something more like mass spec or LC that they could make cheaply without production issues. They viewed NMR as very troublesome, with magnets and probes being unreliable in terms of production yields. I keep asking myself why Varian Agilent failed when Bruker continues. I think that companies have a vision towards a goal that are ones that they generally succeed. I think Frank has a vision for Bruker. I think the Varian brothers had a vision for Varian, but unfortunately, they passed away. Varian wasn't just about NMR. They had other businesses that competed with NMR for resources, and it is the bean counters that hand out the resources in companies like Varian. NMR did not have a visionary leaders like Russell Varian since he was dead. I feel that this was the main reason why it dwindled and failed in the end. So the next question I have is why do I consider these 7 people as magnificent? If you ask NMR spectroscopists to name some early pioneers in NMR, these are names that are frequently mentioned. However, there is one person I feel that I didn't mention who is not on the Magnificent Seven list, and this person is usually not thought of as an early pioneer. but clearly he deserves to be mentioned. And this person is Harry Weaver, the man who designed many of the early NMR magnets, and he was the designer of the first superconducting magnets used in NMR. And one of the things I forgot to say early on is that this is a very West Coast centric talk. I don't even know that the East Coast exists. Is there something out there? Is there an Atlantic Ocean? Oh, I forgot. It's the Trump Ocean right now. Is that right? Anyhow, here's a picture of Harry with the HR 220 in 1963. And it clearly was a revolution at that time. And also, just to say, quite frankly, the bean counters at Varian couldn't stand it. Here's an early picture of Martin, and who saw the very first NMR signal standing with Russ Varian. And this is a very early vintage 30 megahertz NMR spectrometer. It's an HR 60. I think maybe Mr. Conradi may remember this. One of the things that really seems interesting to me is the size of the power supply on the right is huge. It's just absolutely monstrous. Okay, so here's the Magnificent Seven. Jim Arnold, Richard Ernst, Ray Freeman, Howard Hill, Jim Schoolery, Martin Packard, and Wes Anderson. All of these people are deceased except for Howard. Howard is now in a convalescent home. And I can say this, that I have had meals with all of these people. All of them wonderful people. So we're going to start now. What does this title suggest? Are these scientists exceptional enough? This clearly means that they have significance in terms of scientific relevance. Did they do something that changed the history of science? As a result, science and mankind benefited greatly. I'm not sure that was the case, but I am sure that they were a right group of people to take on the challenge of moving NMR forward so that the structure of molecules became clearer. The result of their effort produced a great surge in chemical science, resulting in an increase in the ability to improve the lives of mankind. These are the dates here with which the people that I call the Magnificent Seven entered Varian. You notice the last one was Howard Hill, and the first one was Martin Packard. Jim Schoolery was a very early enter into Varian, as was Wes and Jim Arnold. Ray Freeman and Richard Ernst came later. In examining the list of people you hear, you can see some common threads, but they are rather diverse. Jim Arnold, Ray Freeman, and Jim Schoolery served in the military. Wes Anderson and Martin Packard worked for companies vital to the war effort, and Howard Hill managed to escape military service. Martin Packard was the R&D director of this group. One of the questions that I ask myself, only because of my experience, is what is pure research? I think pure research is sort of different in companies rather than in academia. To say that the management at the time gave them free rein to explore the many potential avenues of NMR. They weren't expected to make a profit. And they didn't need to show progress on new instruments. That was early on. I don't know when exactly that changed, but you could see it creeping in. The main driving force was to improve the ability of NMR to solve chemical problems. And that really was a force of the Varian brothers and also Jim Schoolery. One of the biggest drivers, as I said, was Jim Schoolery, who kept asking for improvements that made NMR easier for chemists to use. He engaged chemists at all levels, showing them the potential of NMR to solve their chemical problems. And one of the things in my experience is that when I was at Agilent, and I wasn't actually in the NMR business, I actually escaped the business and went over to Agilent Labs. There, it was more of a pure research atmosphere, but I would say that it was research without a deliverable. In other words, nobody was asking you to deliver a product, but you were expected to work on problems related to NMR and the business, which I did. And again, I'm saying this again, what do I mean by a pure research environment? In a university, it means freedom to do independent research. In an industrial setting, it's hard to imagine complete freedom to do independent research. I think one way to describe an industrial setting is that you're doing research that is not tied to a deliverable, which I think I said previously. For me, working in Agilent Labs was probably similar to what the Magnificent Seven experienced. Just to give you an example, one of the things that I had been working on for years was how to make an NMR probe that could go from H to F observation and do simultaneous HF observation. And I worked on that for many years, and I had various schemes and ways of doing it. I built various probes that did it, but I was never satisfied with them. They all had certain problems. One of the biggest problems was the customers would get lost in tuning back to an HF capability versus an H/F capability. Then one day, while trying to improve the performance of a 1H circuit in the dual probe, I split the resonance into two modes using inductive coupling, and I finally found a way to do that was simple and free of artifact. This method is currently used by both Booker and Joel in many of their NMR probes, and I predict, at least as far as I can see, every H detect probe will now be H/F in the future, and there's no reason to believe it won't be. Okay, so here's a very interesting picture that shows Jim Schoolery in the first NMR lab. Really interesting 30 megahertz system. Again, the power supply is humongous. So one of the things that really got NMR going was that when Bloch decided after inventing NMR at Stanford, a few years passed, Jim Arnold and Wes Anderson were graduate students, and as Wes said, there's nothing like a motivated professor who could give you a degree if you could move with him to CERN. So what he did. And that's what they did there. But what really happened was quite remarkable. So Jim took what he had there and moved it to CERN, and he started with a 3-blob ethanol spectrum and somehow made it into a high-resolution ethanol spectrum with spin-spins coupling. So it looks pretty similar to what you would see today. Quite remarkable. And I have to say, Jim was a tremendous person in many respects. Just to give you an example, and I have to say, most of this is hearsay because I can't ask anybody, well, how do you remember this? But I was told by Bob Codrington that Jim was a Navy pilot, fought in the Battle of Midway, and he flew a Corsair, and he was quite recognized for his feats. He was also a very interesting character. There are rumors about him still today. He would wander around the lab in his underwear because if he had metal pieces in his pants, then it would infect the magnet and change the resolution. So that wasn't something he wanted to do. I don't know how cold it was at CERN or where this happened, but you have to ask how that happened. Obviously, then there is Wes, and Wes was doing his homonuclear double resonance experiments, and these were quite the start of what you could call structural elucidation in NMR, where you could actually hit something and see a response, and you can figure out that it was a CH2 group or a CH3 group or whatever. And it was really quite telling. And it was really started NMR off in the ability to do structural elucidation. And eventually, we get to 2D NMR with Genair, et cetera. Really quite impressive. So here's some pictures of some of the old systems. You can see how massive they were. You see a shim set there that was designed by Wes Anderson. And when I was at Mark's lab a few years ago in Albuquerque NMR, he pulled off a shim set off a magnet and he said, see, it has Wes Anderson's initials on the back, which was really something. I didn't expect that, but quite interesting. Anyhow, that's some of the hardware of those days here. So one of the things that kind of interesting to me is you read Ray Freeman's article, The Dawn of NMR, and he quotes the following. In the 1930s, if you asked a chemistry student what the structure of ethanol was, he would say CH3, CH2OH. However, he had little proof that this was the case. In fact, I'm at a loss to know exactly how he would know this other than to do various wet chemistry experiments. These experiments obviously would take considerable amount of time to work out the structure. The fact that Jim Schoolery graduated with a PhD from Caltech might seem insignificant, but it may have been one of the biggest reasons NMR expanded so rapidly during the later part of the 1960s. John Roberts joined Caltech in 1953. Jack was using NMR to unravel the structure of molecules. He championed its use. I know that Jim was actively engaged with Caltech when I joined Varian in 1980. The extent of his activities there were not clear to me. However, it would not have been difficult for me to believe that Jack and Jim were knowledgeable about what each of their effort in NMR encompassed. What Jack did was to bring NMR to the average student chemist. This has, of course, resulted in an army of structural elucidation chemists arriving at pharmaceutical companies. And this is where and why it happened. The basic principles of organic chemistry, Robertson Casario. I had this book at Cal State LA. It was one of the first of its kind. The influence of this group on chemistry was very profound. From Wes's early experiments in homonuclear decoupling, it became clear that structural elucidation of organic compounds was possible using NMR. Organic textbooks now began to emphasize proton NMR as a way of determining the structure of molecules. By the mid-1960s, textbooks were like Robertson Casario became very popular, and a new breed of organic chemist was born. So here is the Varian A60 spectrometer. It was a very important first. It was equipped with a pre-scribed chart, calibrated chart paper with an integrator. And of course, Martin Packard thought they would sell only a few, but more than 1,000 units were sold. So Fourier transform NMR really transformed NMR from that point forward. And the idea of using Fourier analysis to extend NMR signal was originally patented by Russell Varian in 1956. His idea used broadband excitation for many frequencies. He then collected the response on a tape that was read into a collector, and each frequency was transformed. The process was extremely slow and impractical. After several attempts, Wes produced the idea using a short coherent RF pulses that could excite the spins, with resulting FID being heterodyned down to the carrier frequency. Even though the scheme was advantageous, the process of digitizing it remained cumbersome. Slowly, the kinks of this process were worked out. The advent of small laboratory computers became a reality, and the NMR signal to noise increased by over 1,000 for the same time of data accumulation. Now, Richard Ernst came to Varian as a postdoc in 1963. He was keenly interested in improving NMR sensitivity. It was rather amazing that he persevered in accumulating the signal and then transferring it to paper tape and then to IBM punch card. This process took days to complete, yet the result was very impressive, an order of magnitude improvement. The idea was simply assigned to Richard. The task of building the spectrometer seemed like a Herculean task, yet he prevailed. He obviously won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this work and its inclusion in NMR systems. So obviously the paper, Ernst and Anderson in Review of Scientific Instruments in 1966 was a major breakthrough for NMR. And they used the IBM mainframe computer at the Bank of America a few blocks away to form from Varian. And these two researchers ushered in a new era of NMR. It took a while to implement into a new spectrometer, but in 1970, the first XL100 was sold to Jack Richards at Caltech. I'm pleased, I had the pleasure of working one at South Carolina. Actually, I think we had the number 2 off the line. Is that correct, Paul? It's really quite remarkable. Here is some notes from Wes Anderson's notebook showing his idea of how to do the FT NMR. And I can't read that very well, but that's not the part here. Okay, so here's a picture of Richard Ernst at Varian demonstrating the first implementation of FT NMR, a key part of his Nobel Prize. Ernst's right hand is adjusting a CAT 1024, and I can remember seeing things with labels like CAT on them, but I don't know what a 1024 is. Maybe you do, Paul, but no? Okay, all right. So here's something that's a little more familiar to me, an XL100 with a 4415 magnet with a Nicolay accessory, a broadband accessory. And this was at the Jackson Labs at DuPont. And I can tell you the number of times I've been there is quite a number. They didn't call it the Jackson Labs. When I was there, they called it the Chamber Works. And it's the only place I've ever been where you can drive your car under what looks like a trough of fluid running over your car. That's just amazing. And this lab was run by an individual by the name of Tony Force, who is actually legendary at DuPont. So anyhow, that's just a sort of an interesting picture of it all. Okay, so how did Ray Freeman get to Varian? Ray Freeman left his position at the UK National Physical Laboratory to join Varian in Palo Alto, California. Ray had applied to a few different laboratories in the US, and the first offer he got came from Wes Anderson. So he took that offer immediately because his young family was very interested in moving to California, obviously. And upon his arrival in California, he was met by Wes and Martin very early in the morning, by the way, in a plane. And Martin gave Ray a car so that Ray and his family could get around Palo Alto. Ray says he later paid Martin $100 for the car. Can't buy a car for $100 today, that's for sure. Okay, so the advent of FT-NMR changed the work that Ray Freeman did. In his early days at Varian, he studied coupling constants and chemical shift. And once the FT era started, then his work included all kinds of different pulse NMR experiments. He used soft pulses, hard pulses, and he did T1 experiments using different ways to determine T1 values. Then things changed again. In 1968, Howard Hill arrived at Varian. This also impacted Ray's work. Both Howard and Ray had spent a considerable amount of time at Oxford working with Sir Rex Richards. Howard published a paper with Rex entitled The Limits of Measurement in Magnetic Resonance. Here he outlines the detail how to calculate the signal to noise for coil detecting an NMR signal. This work continued with Ray at Varian. I have a copy of Research Report 105, a virtual cookbook of how to calculate the signal noise of a solenoid NMR probe. Oops, wrong way. And here on the left is the cover page. And one of the things about this lovely article is they had all these insane parameters, the Nagoka's constant and things like that. And I can remember doing all this when I was at my postdoctoral place in Utah with a 22 millimeter probe that I was working on and calculating the signal to noise, et cetera. And it was really a pain to put all those pieces of information in and also to understand them all. As I said, I use this report and to calculate the signal to noise on this 22 millimeter probe, and it could generate a signal to noise of about 320 to 1 on carbon on 80% dioxane. Now, as most of you know, I design probes today, and of course, today I don't design probes using calculations like the ones shown in Report 105. Today I use circuit fill factor calculations along with finite element calculation, and this avoids using terms like Nagoka's correction constant entirely. Results of these calculations are also very good. And I just want to sort of point out here how this is done to give you an idea. On the left is a very simple double-tuned circuit. The little green things are just straight capacitance to ground. There's an S1, S22 plot overlaid the two, and you see all the resonances in the circuit. And then the whole point of the circuit fill factor is to say for a given mode, where does the energy lie? And so if you look at this, you can see for each of the spikes you see in the middle spectrum, there's a number there on the far right, and you see the various percentage of energy, which must all add up to 1. And you see for 500 megahertz, which is what the proton frequency is supposed to be for the double-tuned circuit, you have only 72% or 73% of the energy resides there. And so it basically says if you manipulate the inductors in the circuit, you can improve this vastly. And that's what you can do today. It makes a big difference. So in finite element calculations, one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, what's the difference between using foil and wire? Here's a good example of it. And you can see that for wire, the Q values are much higher than foil, and that's why you do it. But this is how you absolutely determine the difference between using wire and foil. So these things are the kinds of things that you do today and why it makes so much difference to use these parameters than calculations like we did in the old days. So when Howard came at the beginning of the FT era, his experience working with Sir Rex Richards allowed him to fit well within the group. He soon began publishing papers with Ray. A considerable number of these publications involved C13, T1 studies of molecules, etc. Howard was very much involved with the development of the Varian XL100 and the CFT20. It is not clear to me exactly how he fit into the group from the pure research point of view. Clearly, he interacted with all the members, but I think his role evolved more into a traditional member of an R&D team. I met Howard in South Carolina when he came to show me the CFT20 spectrometer. This was in 1973. I interacted with Howard also when I was at Utah. Howard also was key in development of the superconducting 300 magnet system there. This was the instrument that had a very poor, thoroughly thought out decoupler using a 10 millimeter C13 probe. In fact, as Don Oldham would say, you could heat your coffee easily with this probe. So that prompted Don Oldham to devise a better decoupling coil, and this coil is now known as the Oldham-Grant coil and is widely used in some derivative form by nearly all the NMR vendors. From what I can tell, Howard became the in-house NMR guru for Varian in 1973. At that time, Richard and Ray had left, and the Magnificent Seven was basically disbanded. Anderson and Arnold now were moved to the newly created Central R&D and Wes, and Martin moved to the upper management. Now, the one thing I didn't say was that in 1972 or 3, Wes Anderson was actually laid off by Varian, and 2 months later, they made him the manager of Central R&D. So you can figure how the management thought in those days. It was pretty crazy. It's not much crazier than it is today. So here's a picture of Howard standing by a CFT20. This is 1973. Yeah. And they drove it around the country in a truck, and they would take it out and demonstrate it too. That's pretty quite remarkable. We got one of these at South Carolina, and I wrote a paper on determining the methyl barriers to rotation using spin rotation relaxation. And it was really a fun exercise for me. So now that everything is sort of disbanded, a new R&D manager emerged. Bob Codrington joined Varian in 1962. He was a Canadian who got his undergraduate degree at UBC and served in the Canadian Navy during World War II. After the war, he got his master's degree in mathematics from UBC and his PhD from Notre Dame. He taught at Rutgers University and then went on to work at Schlumberger before coming to Varian. Bob became the head of product engineering at Varian Instrumentation Division in 1963. After Richard Ernst and Wes Anderson and Ray Freeman had exited from NMR division, he became the keeper of the keys, all the intellectual property of Varian NMR of that era. I don't know exactly when he became the R&D manager of NMR at this time. Bob passed the keeper of the keys on to Howard later when Bob became the manager of the Animal Imaging Group, Cisco in Fremont, California. Bob recruited me and a number of other people who are in this room come to Varian. So that's the end of this talk, and what I have here is the Varian first and key patents. And one of the things I want to say is that to this group is it's my goal for the last 10 years, ever since I started consulting for JOL, was to make this a two-horse race at NMR. Booker is dominating this tremendously. And my goal is to make it a two-horse race. And the most obvious outfit to join is obviously Joel, because they don't have the second largest percentage of customers, which is, compared to Booker, rather low. But I can say that we are making progress. We made tremendous progress last year and this year. And just to give you an example, Joel is investing very heavily in NMR. They're expanding the operations in Peabody, Massachusetts, and they recently bought a JazTech magnet from Kobe Steel. So now they have the ability to make their own magnets and make money from it. So all of this is very important for the survival of NMR. And I feel very proud to be a representative of them and also the work that the group that I formed in Peabody has accomplished. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions? Yes.
There's a very early photo at the beginning, and it's maybe the third slide in your talk.
That's the
And
first.
what I want to point out about the photo, it's Russ Varian.
Yeah.
And maybe Wes, I'm not sure, but note who took the photo.
I don't.
And the photo was taken by Ansel Adams.
Well, oh yeah. Well, this is the one.
Okay.
This is the one by Ansel.
Yeah. I mean, that gives you a sense of the historic nature of who these people were. I mean, Ansel, you didn't sit for a portrait with Ansel Adams if you were just a guy on the street.
Well said, Ron. Yeah. I don't see, the thing is that I keep asking myself what failed, and I think really it's because Russell Varian passed away. I mean, if you look at Apple, Jobs was a nightmare. I mean, and, if you read Walter Isaacson's book about Steve Jobs, you say, how in the heck did this guy ever succeed? He was everything bad. He took drugs. He was a sexist, everything you can name. I mean, he stole ideas. Seriously. I mean, you look at it, Isaacson makes no bones about it. But he was driven to do it. He would argue with people at demonstrations of their products for hours about the color of various pieces of paper that the items were sitting on. It wasn't the right shade of blue. I mean, you say, what shade of blue do you want, dude? Seriously. But it just takes that kind of drive to make it happen. And I'm not saying that Frank Laukien is all of that, but I can tell you that compared to the managers that I saw at Varian and Agilent, not the same thing, just not.
Toby, in my roaming around Varian,
Say that again?
in my roaming around Varian,
Yeah.
quasi-conscious and everything, the word anaspec came to mind. Anaspec was the people that tried to manage all the facilities at Varian, and they screwed up everything.
Okay.
They were the leaders of MBAs who
Right.
basically couldn't spell MBAs. But they had no idea about science, and they just systematically screwed up the app lab, and from there on. Anyway,
So
that's my
one of the things that it's hard to even try to contemplate the difference, but at Varian, because I was in Adjunct Labs, I didn't have any direct role with Regina. I would just listen to her, and it just drove me crazy. And I said, what a bunch of nonsense. And then you go over to Joel, and we're talking about a company that speaks a different language. And what I found in going to Joel's the 7 times I've been there in Akashima is, first of all, they all speak really good English, so I don't have to learn Japanese, which is a very good thing. But the second thing is they pay attention to you. Everybody there pays attention to what you're saying, and I have had no problems with creativity at all. They say, you want to do this, here's some ideas, do it. And I have something like 6 patents through with them now, and it's creative heaven, really. I mean, sure, there are people that don't care for some of the things you do, and I get it, but when you keep producing products and probes and patents, who's going to stop you, really? And the one thing I will say is that the people that I hired for these positions, they're every bit as good as anything we ever had at Varian. Really, really, really good people. And so I'm very happy. I mean, I couldn't be happier. And when somebody says there's a guy in the back seat there's Paul sitting there, and he said, guess what? We really did a bang-up job on our European sales this year, higher than we've had for a long, long time. And the Booker people call me the Marble Man. I could care less.
Toby,
Yeah.
you talked up to Howard Hill time and things like that, and then jump to Agilent. I'm not trying to defend Agilent, but something happened in between that 30 years that was the downfall of Varian selling it to Agilent and Agilent shutting it down. So there is any perspective on what? I wasn't there maybe 50% of the time in the 30 years, but what is your?
Well, I
what is your thoughts on that?
think if you read Ray and Gareth's paper when Agilent folded, and in there they say, at some point they said, we're not interested in going to high field, and by then it was too late. And I think
Mistakes.
right, and I think they're right. And just for those who don't know, I shared an office with Gareth Morse in 1980. Gareth and I are very good friends. And all I can say is that they hit the nail on the head. And momentum is important in this business. It really is. And the thing that I'll just say this, we're building this on one customer at a time, and we're a multinational company. And what's so pleasing to me is in Peabody, you see Japanese people working side by side with Americans, and they're just as good as us, and we're working just as hard as they are. It's fantastic. There is no difference. Just when I hear all this DEI crap, I want to throw up. Say, really, it's just nonsense. People are people. That's to say that the thing that just gets me, that one of the guys came over here and I said, well, where did you get your PhD? At Tokyo Metropolitan. And he said physics. And then you say, oh, what kind of courses did you take? And he starts to go, please stop. I don't want to know it more. But they're really good and they're very nice and nobody gets mad at anybody.
In your opinion, the cryoprobe development, I think it's working. Cryoprobe development on Brooker.
Can you speak a little louder? My hearing is terrible.
Oh, sorry. The cryoprobe development that Brooker achieved and Varian did not. Do you think that was detrimental to the company? Varian.
So let me just say this. When Varian bought NMR, we all went down there, and the head of NMR, the head of Varian, Jan Sheeta, got up at a all-employee meeting, said, well, we only have 2 orders for cryoprobes, and Brooker, I think, sold 4 last year. Don't worry about it. They're not going anywhere. A month later, we had another meeting. What? Everything and no room temperature probes. We're not making any more of those. I'm not kidding. That was how ridiculous it was. So yes, cryoprobes are hard to build. You can design them, make them, and you have to have people who have experience in making them. Now, I want to tell you that 8 years ago, when we started building them at Joel and Peabody, nobody there had experience building them. I had 2 students who worked for Sanjay Han down at UCSB who did helium DNP experiments, but they didn't. I showed them how to build the probes, but they're the ones who learned how to do the helium. So now we're building probes. We're building cryoprobes, and they're working really, really good. So it takes effort.
At Joel, I presume.
Huh?
At Joel, you're building cryoprobes.
Yes.
Okay.
In Peabody and in Tokyo.
Okay.
You can buy one today. I'm not kidding. I mean, what did you think?
I think Varian should have made the cryoprobes earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Well. I mean.
I have a question over here.
It is.
Or a comment.
Another person.
Yeah, it's quite an honor to speak directly with distinguished specialist from Varian. And I worked for Brooker for 26 years as service manager and sales manager. So I have this impression why Varian failed, and which I had been carrying this impression for many years. So yeah, it's quite a good chance to speak directly with you. Maybe it's a bit frankly, because I was in service in Brooker, China.
Mm-hmm.
When a customer had a broken amplifier, I repaired the model inside the amplifier, and I charge the customer the model. So maybe $1,000 or $2,000. But by the time Varian in China, they don't service parts in the amplifier, they replace amplifier. They charge customer $20,000 US. So they put customers in the awkward position, and there's a lot of complaints from Varian customers, and customers happy with Brooker service. This is one aspect. The other aspect is only at that time. Yeah, only at that time. Yeah. Sorry for my being so frank, but that's what is in practice.
Well, these stories are stories that working at Varian inside Palo Alto, you don't hear that. I will say the only time I ever ran into any customers that had anything to do with China was we were training applications chemists from China, and I had the experience of eating a meal with these guys, and they were petrified. We took them to a Mexican restaurant, and they were petrified of the food. I mean, I guess if I were a foreign person and eating different food of that difference, I might have been scared too. But it was just sort of weird, and so I don't hear these kinds of stories. It doesn't surprise me, you know.
Yeah, I think these are not. It's happening actually with broker customers right now.
Yeah.
Broker is following. Yeah, you know, the broker is now replacing amplifiers
Right.
instead of servicing them, and charge customer $20,000.
Right.
Yeah, as Varian did a decade ago. Yeah, so I'm not happy with broker what it's doing, and I think
You're not the only one.
many customers worldwide, they are not happy. Yeah.
I mean, I think.
Yeah, in the house of Varian. Okay, and another case that impresses me about that Varian many years ago installed their first coil probe in China, and it comes you know, there's this transfer tube to the coil probe. Yeah, they hold it tight on the ground with sandbags.
Yeah.
Sandbags.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. Well, customer get this impression that Varian is making a joke on their coil probe, you know. But broker delivered the coil probe with transfer line on a very heavy aluminum pot, so it helped to reduce the vibration. Yeah.
So one of the things that I found out is I worked at Nalarak for years selling lots of probes to 3M. And so I had a design that they liked, the 16 millimeter probe. And they had an outfit in Shanghai, 3M.
Yeah.
And we shipped a probe there. And what did we find? Well, the service engineer said, well, these Wilmed NMR tubes are way, way too expensive. I bet you can use 16 millimeter regular quartz glass. So they stuck them in the probe, and guess what? The probe's coils were all broken. And you say, well, who did that? It just sheer graft, you know, that's just all it is. You know, I don't know how else to say it, but none of these stories surprise me. The thing is that, as I said, it's one customer at a time. You've got to ensure that the customer is getting what he wants and keep it that way.
Yeah.
You know, and people get lousy service, do lousy service.
Yeah.
You know, they're the worst.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Questions? Okay. So I'd like to, well, okay, let's get Toby.
Thank you. Look, thank all of you. This was a very difficult talk for me to make because it's very emotional when you see all this and all these people and you spend years doing it. And you know, just sort of part of your life. You know, a big milestone in your life was to become a Varian person and be a Varian fellow and all that. And I can say, when I was at Cal State LA, I never thought I would have ever gotten this far in my life. So I achieved that, and I'm now 80, and I'm a very happy old man.
Thank you, Toby.
And to all of the former Varian personnel here, I want to thank all of you for your kind consideration over the years.
Toby, really nice, and you know, I appreciate your ongoing enthusiasm about life in general. You just turned 50, more or less, more or less.
Thing, because when I joined, I thought I'm too old to be doing this, you know.
No, you're not. No, you're not.
It showed how old I really.
But in particular, you know, Toby, thank you very much for your continuing enthusiasm with the Ivan Group and your participation. And we look we look towards much more to come. Thank you, Toby. We appreciate it.